Chapter 4. If I say so myself. In those days, the city of Syracuse consisted of two parts. One, located on the small island of Ortygia, was the original Old Town, and had by then already existed for several hundred years, remembering perhaps the days of Odysseus. A narrow channel cut off this island from a much larger peninsula, where the newer and more modern part of the city lay. Old Ortygia was crowded, with 2- and 3-story houses piled one on top of the other, and narrow winding passages between them. There were few places in these streets where 2 carts could pass each other, and most were only accessible by foot. There were no gardens or greenery, and the traditional open-air courtyards of Greek homes were tiny here. Most of the residents were working poor and slaves. Even the square in front of the old town hall, the Bouleuterion, was extremely small, not at all corresponding in size to the importance of this great city. Everything here was subordinated to one goal: to fit as many houses and people into the tiny space of the island as possible. Only one patch of land, near the spring of Arethusa, was surrounded by a small wreath of greenery: palms, rhododendrons, and quince trees. People crowded here because the island's position offered protection. Ortygia could be attacked only from the sea. This position determined the development of the city. From its very beginnings and for centuries, Syracuse had striven to become and remain, above all, a sea power. Centuries of investment paid off. Syracuse was, by now, one of the 3 largest commercial and naval ports in the entire Mediterranean, and she commanded the 3rd largest naval fleet in the world. Twice in her history was she to cross swords with the greatest maritime powers of her time: once with Carthage, several decades after the events described here, and the second time with Athens, several dozen years after that. Both wars were to end in the defeat of her enemies, and the dates of those victories were to become the major turning points in the history of the entire Greek world. As the city grew, tiny Ortygia could no longer accommodate all of its inhabitants, and therefore the second part of the city was established on the mainland. This new part extended more widely and more freely, and soon exceeded the home island in size and splendor. The houses there were more spacious and richer. Behind their white walls, single-story villas stood in delightful gardens, and clumps of palm trees, fig trees, and olive trees swayed overhead in gentle sea breezes. Massive defensive fortifications protected the new city. A large sea wall was also built to protect the entrance to the Ortygia Channel between the island and the peninsula. South of this dam, between the shores of the 2 cities, was the port, full of countless boats, ships, barges, and great war galleys. And into this port, on the 3rd day, came the little boat of the runaways from Carthage. Callias's house was in the newer western part of Syracuse, near the sea and the great defensive walls enclosing the city from the land side. But it was not possible to moor the boat here because the shore was a steep cliff, and the sea was full of treacherous rocks. And so they left the boat at a considerable distance from the house, where the shore descended gently towards the sea, allowing it to be hauled out on dry land. They arrived at dawn, and almost immediately went to Callias's house for a well-deserved rest. Everyone slept the whole day through. But in the evening, as was customary, all the neighbors and friends of Callias, and friends of these friends, and all his relatives and relatives of these relatives, gathered in a great throng to listen to the stories of the returning traveller. There came so many of them that the house and its courtyard could not accommodate them all, so they sat down on the waterfront in front of the house. They brought wine, wheat and barley cakes, olives and cheese, and began to feast and make merry, laughing and joking, surrounded by a crowd of playing children. Callias, the most important person of the moment, sat down in the middle of the crowd on a large boulder and talked long and colourfully about all his recent adventures, embroidering richly. Greeks love such stories, enjoyed them like children, not really caring whether everything in them was entirely true. Only one thing was shameful in a storyteller, and that was when he was boring, unable to frighten or delight his audience. Of this, however, there was no fear. Even when nothing remarkable happened to him, Callias could talk about it in fascinating and entertaining ways, even more so now, when he really did have something to tell. The word of their adventure had spread somehow, even as the runaways were sleeping. So the crowd turned up in large numbers, expecting a good tale. They plied Callias copiously with wine, clapped hands, cheered, asked questions. And Callias, excited by the party, warmed by wine, looking at the enraptured faces of the listeners, talked, added, twisted, and told it all. What had been and what could have been, and what had not been at all. And thus, according to him, as they were leaving Carthage, several guard galleys had spotted them at the entrance to the port, and chased them for several hours, and only thanks to Callias's agility and to the darkness of the night had they managed to get away safely. He described the details of the chase so poignantly, about how they had heard the voices and saw the lights of the galleys surrounding them, that not only all the Syracusans, but even Melocles himself trembled with excitement and suspense. Callias then went on to relate their encounter with the pirate boat. "The robbers," he said, "were so close now that they began pelting us with arrows. We, of course, were not idle, and I myself, you know how good I am with the bow and arrows, am pleased to tell you that I shot one of these scoundrels right in the face. He got it so good that he didn't even manage a yelp. He just keeled over the side and, whoop, plunged into the sea. That served him right. By Hermes, I tell you, it was a damn good shot, comrades." The horror of the story and the audience's excitement came to a crescendo when Callias showed his chiton, pierced through by an arrow. In fact, it was torn already in Syracuse as they pulled the boat ashore. Everyone was moved. Nehurabed, who appeared at the door of the house and listened to the story, only shook his head in admiration. Callias spoke primarily of himself, of course, but he did not spare words of praise for the others, for the helmsman who had seen the coming of the wind just in time, and who, by turning the boat around, probably saved them from sinking, and for Melocles, who had grabbed a sword, ready to defend himself, and later helped pilot the boat in the storm, and for the foreigner, who had stood ready to fight hand to hand alongside them, despite his, advanced decrepitude. When Callias finished, there was shouting and applause. Everyone took him in their arms and hugged him, inquiring about the minutest details. "We have not heard such a story in a long time," they all said unanimously. Then Melocles, in turn, had to tell his own story, how pirates had attacked his uncle's boat between Massilia and Parthenope, how he fought, how he was wounded, how he worked and suffered in his inhuman captivity, how he tried to escape, was recaptured, and condemned to a cruel death, and how, at the last minute, Callias and the mysterious foreigner turned up to rescue him. He didn't speak, it must be understood, as well as Callias, but truth shone in his story, and the audience did not spare him words of sympathy and appreciation. Then the conversation turned to other topics. Some old Greek described a recent battle against the Etruscans, whom he had been obliged to fight when a storm forced him on the Etruscan shore during a journey from Massalia to Cumae. Someone else described how, in a similar battle against the Etruscans 2 years ago, he had been captured and then escaped to take refuge among the Ramans. He spoke of the great city of these Ramans called Rama, or Roma, and which was almost as beautiful as Syracuse, except it lay inland, far away from the shore. Most of the listeners already knew these stories, but listened to them willingly again because nothing could be more pleasing to a Greek than to experience travel in this way, learning about foreign peoples, countries, cities, their mysteries, monsters, and dangers. Night fell, the moon rose over the bay, distant hills disappeared in the black night, and they still chatted, remembering old times, mocking a little, and making fun of each other and themselves. Only the chill of midnight, as it was already late autumn, drove them home at last. Then busy days began for Melocles. Busy but calm and measured, full of steady work on the boat, replacing worn-out planks, sewing a new sail, repairing damaged nets, twisting and coiling ropes, hewing new oars. These activities filled his whole day. There was a lot of work, and Callias was both demanding and quick-tempered, but Melocles felt joyful and happy. He knew this work well. The son of a sailor and a fisherman, the nephew of a ship's carpenter, familiar from childhood with such life, he performed well, and Callias found him useful. This did not save him from the Syracusans' anger on several occasions, because Callias could not live without such outbursts, but they were never too dangerous. Whenever the boy took these displays of displeasure too much to heart, Callias became a little abashed, smiling kindly, joked, and, patting him on the shoulder, repeated, "Come on, boy. When you stay with me, with Callias, you will learn it all perfectly." But he treated the boy better every day. "Indeed, it is a good thing that we saved this kid," nearly escaped his lips one evening as he spoke to Nehurabed. The mysterious stranger remained a guest in Callias's house throughout his stay in Syracuse. The Greek was clearly pleased with this, first because the hospitality was not free, but also, and above all, because the man's presence added weight and splendor to his house. He told everyone about Nehurabed, explained that he must be a very important person, probably an ambassador, maybe even a prince or great priest or fortune-teller, and, most likely, all of the above. He treated Nehurabed with great deference, especially in the presence of others, so that everyone might see what kind of an exalted guest he, Callias, had in his house. As always, Nehurabed took it silently and indifferently, which only increased the mystery. The Greek did not know much about him now than he had known before, but he soon learned that the old man had been to the town hall and the council's palace, and to Praxiteles himself, the deputy of the absent tyrant of Syracuse. Nehurabed was an important person, it seemed, whoever he was. Melocles rarely saw Nehurabed now, since he spent whole days working on the boat, and even slept by it every other night, unrolling his mat on the wide bench at the stern. However, whenever they met, the distinguished guest always asked him in detail how his work went, how he liked it, and how long he had committed to working as a labourer for Callias. The boy looked at him with the same respect and awe as before, but these feelings were now connected, in a strange way, with a growing, blind, almost childish trust. He also sincerely regretted that the old man was leaving Syracuse in a few days, on his way to Greece or Egypt, and he thought with sadness about the upcoming goodbye. And then an accident happened, which again turned his life upside down.